All right, so let me introduce Sarah here on the fly. This is Sara Waldorf, who started working at Signum 7 years ago, she tells me, and started taking classes here and there at whatever interested her, and then got about halfway towards a master's degree, decided that this was something she wanted to finish. So here she is now finished as we present our presentation. And let me say it's been... I was very excited to be asked to do this. This is right up my alley, and it's been a real pleasure working with Sarah over the last years on the case study functions of the dative case in Beowulf. So with that really brief introduction, I think I'm going to just kind of cancel my screen, and Sarah, you take over.
All right, so hopefully everybody should be able to see the presentation there now.
Yes.
All right, good. So this kind of grew out of a question that I had during the Beowulf translation class that I took, and it was a question that there didn't seem to be an answer to. So almost 3 years later, I'm not sure I'm any closer necessarily to finding an answer, but when you start exploring the question, sometimes the answer becomes something of a bonus. So my project was on the functions of the dative case in Beowulf, and just for the purposes of this thesis, we had to just choose a segment, and so it's been restricted to lines 1439 to 2439. So the dative case is one of the original 8 known Proto-Indo-European noun cases. Originally, there was a nominative case, which was the subject case, the vocative, which is the case of direct address. The accusative was the direct object. The genitive was possessive. The dative could indicate the indirect object or possession or the beneficiary of an action. The ablative case was the source or the place from which. Instrumental case was the means, the accompaniment, the agency by which an action was done, and the locative was the place where. And those are kind of simplifications of how the case system functioned, but just in general, those were the functions of the different cases. And then by the time of Old English, the noun cases had been reduced to 4 with just remnants of a 5th case. So what remained was the nominative and the accusative, the genitive, and a dative/instrumental case. The vocative case got folded in with the nominative, and all the other cases, the locative, the ablative, the instrumental, kind of all went together with the dative case. The instrumental case does remain here and there in Old English, just primarily in certain pronouns. And there are many uses of the dative case where you could say it has an instrumental function, but it's not separately identifiable. The word forms are identical with the dative case. And so what you had was one case form that had functions of these 4 different historical cases. So there was the functions of the original dative case, and that was an action performed to or towards someone. There was the functions of the instrumental case, the means by which, or the manner, and the locative, which was the locating place, and the ablative. And so what you've got is one case with multiple functions. You can distinguish the functions still because you can tell from how we think the sentence should be translated that a case has a certain function, but there aren't any distinctively written case endings anymore. So the result, or this was the result of case syncretism. As time went on, the endings to the different cases started sounding more and more alike, and eventually they simply became alike. And so things that originally had distinctive endings no longer had distinctive endings. If it was necessary to distinguish a meaning that the ending used to show, they had to come up with other ways of doing that. So for the dative cases in Beowulf, as I said, I had a question in class. We were translating through the entire poem, beginning at the beginning and going straight through. And there came a point where, just in the kind of total immersion of this, I suddenly said, I think the poet is using the dative case differently now than a few sections back. And there wasn't an answer for that question. There was no, the instructor didn't know, and I have not been able to find a lot of literature on the subject, at least not in English, in the past couple of years. It might be that there is something in German. I would have enjoyed having the time to learn some German and be able to check that out. I did find a master's thesis by Louis G. Heller, which he did for Columbia University back in, I think, sometime in the 1950s, called The Dative and Instrumental Cases in Beowulf. And that was very useful because he cataloged the occurrences of the dative case and organized them according to his categorization of them. The couple of problems with that was it was still incomplete. He would give line numbers where the dative would occur and not always which actual word was the dative word in that line. And I think I looked over maybe 2,000 lines of the poem matching up with what Heller had found. And I think in those 2,000 lines, I came up with about 100 instances of the dative case that he did not have listed. And then another problem with the way that he kind of had his categories organized was it was a hierarchical organization, which was kind of difficult to work with, or to really, it very well defined things down to a last degree, but it made too many separate kinds of categories, so that you couldn't really compare across, from category to category, how often they occurred. So with that in mind, the first step in doing this project was to figure out, what it was that we needed to do. And so I went at it by identifying, sorry, I should say, the question was, can we tell if there's a difference? Data on the different usages. And one thing that intrigued me while I was looking at this was reading Michael Drout's Beowulf Unlocked, which identifies similarities between different Beowulf based on vocabulary. And it intrigues me that thing might someday Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we're good. You're back.
Okay. Let's see. So, whoops, I doesn't want to go back to where it was. Okay. I think it was in the middle of this slide here. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, you were talking about reading Drought's Beowulf Unlocked.
Right. I think I'm going to stop with the webcam while I'm doing this presentation because it seems to be slowing things down. Okay. So yes, so Beowulf Unlocked identifies similarities and differences between segments based on vocabulary, and it just seemed to me interesting that the potential might be there to do the same with grammar. And in the Beowulf Unlocked, Drought identifies segment J, which he designates it, and that's a passage that has distinctively weak links to the material around it. And the thing that was really interesting to me was that was right near the point in the poem where I was starting to notice a difference in the dative use. And, you know, I'm keeping in mind I'm this very new reader of Old English, and there was something there that was noticeable even to a novice just from the sheer stretch of translating through the entire poem, being immersed in it, and then suddenly starting to notice, you know, that there was something different in the style. So that kind of raises the question, you know, does it matter? Why is this important? Is this just a small thing to investigate? Well, if we can show patterns of different usages, it might have ramifications for date, for authorship, for dialect, anything like that. The same types of things that have been done with vocabulary could be approaches used on grammar. And I just kind of got the idea of beginning on a database of the dative case uses in Beowulf to make that an available resource for people wanting to study those kinds of questions from the point of view of grammatical style or grammatical usage. So the focus for this project was 1,000 lines. That is roughly not quite a third of the poem, but it covers the spot where I noticed the difference. It goes 500 lines on either side of the change of scribal hands. And that was about that point was when I noticed. I wouldn't say that it started becoming different at the point of the scribal change exactly, but it was a convenient marker. And so this passage, this segment of 1,000 lines, contains a few of the notable passages in the poem. It's got what's known as Hrothgar's sermon, Beowulf's recapitulation speech about his journey and all his exploits when he returns home. It does include Drought segment J. And so focusing on this 1,000 lines, I identified what shows up currently as 587 uses of the dative case. And to arrive at that number, I counted only unique occurrences. So times where there was an adjective modifying a noun when both were in the dative, that was just counted as one. Times when there are several dative words that are all in apposition, all dependent on the same verb, that I counted as one occurrence, and governed by the same verb and all fulfilling the same function. So after identification, then the next step was categorization. And for this, I have a spreadsheet. It could easily be imported into some kind of database software if the right kind for the usage is found. And you can kind of see I had columns for including if there was a verb or an adjective that seemed to be significant in whether or in why this particular noun was in the dative case, and for including prepositions. And then I had a column for the categories, for the uses that these datas were fulfilling. And some of them were dependent on the verbs, and some of them were not. Some of them were just other uses for the dative. So the 22 categories that I came up with are listed here. There's no right or wrong. I've seen many different categorizations. Sometimes they tend to be more and more detailed, sometimes like colors. And then there's some people that have tried to basically fit them to within 3 or so broad categories. And what I was after was categories that would be specific enough, but not too specific. So I wanted them to be able to express what function the dative was fulfilling, especially if it would also kind of give you an idea which of the 4 historical cases that function belonged to. But I didn't want to get so detailed that we had we had a bunch of categories that had only 1 or 2 occurrences, because it's hard to make generalizations when everything is so very specific and detailed. So I'm not going to go into explanations of what all 22 categories are and how I arrived at them, but just for a couple of examples, these were 2 of the most common. The locative function was probably the most common function of the dative case. So you can see right there that the locative case combining with the dative case made huge changes in how the dative was used. And when you think of how you might translate the locative into modern English, you're usually translating it with the prepositions from or to as indicating direction. And then the second largest category, or one of the second largest, I actually split into 2 categories because they are quite different. They're dative for different reasons. So the use with verbs encompasses functions where the dative is the direct object of the verb and where it's the indirect object. And both of these translate fairly similarly into modern English with prepositions for or to. And this kind of to is not a direction, but an idea of reception. So you are giving something to someone. And let's see. And the uses of the dative with verbs are sometimes very arbitrary. Sometimes these kind of seem to make sense based on what the verb is. The dative with the direct object is used when the verb grammatically requires a dative case, and that's often historically determined. Sometimes no logic to it, although sometimes it does indicate a logical recipient of an action. Verbs meaning give or take usually need a dative direct object. The indirect object is kind of the function that's most closely linked with the historical Indo-European use of the dative case. And it generally refers to the recipient, of something else. So a noun gives another noun to a third noun, and the third noun would be the dative case as the indirect object, as in the islands gave tribute to the king. So with that kind of all figured out, and it looks like it's tied up nice and neatly, but it's not quite as neat as fitting it into these nice little categories shows. But they had to go into some category. So then the next step was to just run a bunch of formulas and come up with statistics on the use of the datives in these different sections of the poem. So I don't know, at last count, I had on this this page of the spreadsheet, I had at least 1,000 formulas. And these are counting formulas. They're not formulas that you can just do an automatic copy and paste and have it fill in a whole row. But this was where things really started to get interesting, because you could see differences, slight differences often between the overall totals, like I show here, and an individual segment. You could compare different sections. I kind of took the sections as thematic, so they're not necessarily the same length or anything like that. But for example, using Hrothgar's sermon as one section, because that's likely to have been kind of written all with the same theme and from the same viewpoint, and so it should have fairly similar dative uses within it. So what you see there is you see the categories that I chose, and then this slide shows the total selection, how many occurrences of the dative in each category, and then the percentage of the whole of those occurrences. And then in the next light column, there's a particular segment that I've singled out, and then you see the number of datives in each category in that segment, and then the percentage of the whole there. And for the most part, there was a lot of uniformity, or in just a little variation between one and another, and that's fairly to be expected. It's when there is something that's different, it gets interesting, and you kind of start to wonder why. I also made formulas for counting the datives used with prepositions versus the ones used without prepositions. And I didn't count whether a particular preposition occurred with any particular category, although it could be done. I mean, there could be formulas modified to do that. But here you'll see the total number of datives with prepositions, and then the percentages there are the percentages of total dative usage within that category that use prepositions. So as you can see, the locative has a very high percentage of preposition use, and some other ones have very low percentages. And again, that's to be expected. There are some uses of the dative that use prepositions far more regularly, and there were some that did not. I mean, there was no need for it in what it was attempting to express. You will sometimes see that people will categorize the dative uses and sometimes include a category for dative with preposition. And I did not do that, because usually, even when there's a preposition, there is something else going on. There's some reason for that dative case that it's not like it's caused by the preposition. So there is some function that the dative is fulfilling, and the function may require a preposition most of the time. It may not, or sometimes the preposition might be optional, and that's where it can be interesting to compare the uses with the preposition or without. So I then made some fun little diagrams, which kind of really helps to visualize how some of the different functions are used. And So you can see the one there on the left represents the entire selection of 1,000 lines that I was working with, and you can see the locative takes up almost a quarter of the entire uses. And then you can see on the right that that's specifically Hrothgar's sermon. And there's a significant amount of difference in how the datives are used there versus overall. Now, this by itself is not really telling us a lot, because the entire selection, you have to keep in mind, is going to wind up kind of coming to an average. It's going to include passages that use the datives very far in one direction and passages that use them very far in another direction. But it is interesting to be able to see that there is differences. I mean, there's times when one use sees a lot more in a given passage than in another one. So this diagram here is kind of representing the place where I thought I had noticed the difference in the dative function when I was translating it the first time. So by the time I got into doing this whole project, finding an answer to the question of what was different kind of had become a bonus, because the focus kind of shifted more towards the study itself and gathering the information itself. But once I had the information, I was still curious. The question was still there. And so this is how it looked for, I think I ran 50 lines on either side of the scribal break, just to see if I could pin down what might have looked different to me. And as you can see, there is a lot of difference. On the portion before, there's way more than the average amount of locatives and very little else, really. And in the 50 segments, just following the scribal break, there is a lot more variety. And the way I would describe it is the dative had to do a lot more heavy lifting in that segment. It was being used for a lot of different functions, and that shows up when you're looking at it. It's a lot harder to untangle what actually it's doing in each phrase, because some of these are things where the dative case isn't helped much by prepositions or other words in conveying the meaning. The poem is relying a lot on simply the grammar of the dative case to convey meaning. So I would say that this here is probably my answer to that question. As I'm coasting along through a section where there's a lot of very straightforward dative case uses and predominantly locative, and then you stumble into this where it's got all these colors on the wheel, and you know, nothing stays the same for very long. It just seems all over the board as to what exactly is this form doing. And so I just kind of just the other day, just for the fun of it, I also ran a percentage diagram on drought segment J versus just a minute, I had something blocking my. Okay, go ahead. There we go. Versus what had occurred previous to it in the selection that I was looking at. And you can see differences there too. You can see that in the previous material that there was a much more balanced use of the datives. You'll see more colors there. you'll see, pretty even segments except for the 3 or so that are bigger than the other ones. And then in the diagram on the left, if you're going clockwise from 12 o'clock on, it looks a lot the same until you get to about the 7 o'clock point. And then you can see a lot more unevenness and some categories that are either larger or smaller than the surrounding ones. And again, this by itself is not conclusive because you're looking at a much smaller segment compared to a much larger segment, and things don't get ironed out as much. I mean, you can have a reason for why a certain use would be predominant in a small segment, and it would seem to really overpower the other uses. But it is instructive that you can see this kind of thing and visualize, and this is kind of what I'm hoping is going to be a kind of usage, or a kind of resource for people who want to take it a step further and start to really look at this and see what can we really discover about the poem from this. So just to show another kind of possibility of visual representation, I did a couple of diagrams showing the datives with and without prepositions. This is the same 2 segments we were looking at in the last slide. So draw out segment J and the previous lines from line 1437 or whatever I had there. And so the blue bars are the dative uses without the prepositions, and then the purple added in is the dative use with prepositions. And you can see that in the larger segment, more of the poem overall, that the preposition use is slightly higher. So again, just another interesting way that we can use this kind of a tool to look at the data that we do have and that we can glean from the poem. So this is the end of the presentation. It's not the end of the project. As I said, we had to limit it to 1,000 lines in scope. So my eventual goal is to identify and categorize the datives in the poem's entirety. So I've completed roughly 1/3 of that, almost, not quite. And my goal is to go on and to finish the rest of it, and then whether that's something that I can proceed on and use to do any further studying of the grammar, or whether it's a resource that other scholars would like to use, I would like to make it available, and people can use that and apply that to the study of the poem. So thank you. I'm just happy that people came to hear this today, and I guess time for some questions now.
Yeah, we've got time, so good. So Joe says, just comments that have been made during your talk. Joe says your fans demand a scatter plot. So thanks, Joe. And I'm
not really a statistics kind of person, so there's the information. If somebody can do that with it, that would be great.
And Karita has 3 comments. She says, I love a good pie chart. Well done. And then in terms of the chart showing the huge difference in the locatives in particular, she says, wow, what a difference. And then she just posted, well done, Sarah. Is there anywhere people can see your work and keep? Is that the full question? Keep up with this project. And I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody now so that you can talk to Sarah directly. Maybe I'm going to. Yeah, there we go. All right, so I've unmuted everybody who's attending. So you should be able to talk to Sarah directly. So I will start the question war, and just kind of okay. So you addressed a little bit of why this project, but I want to press you a little bit more. Is you had a question in class, but why take that question about datives and counting datives and categorizing datives into a big project? That's not your average English person's or literature person's thing to do.
Yeah, I guess the real answer has to be because it bugged me. I couldn't ever find an answer to it. I kind of was keeping my eyes open over a couple of years of, studying, just basically studying philology at Signum. And I couldn't find that anyone had addressed this aspect of the poem in such a way that would answer my question. So when it came time to really start thinking about what my thesis should be, there was the question, and since I hadn't been able to find an answer, it just seemed like something that would be worth working on because I already had the interest in it. And so it's quite different from the traditional thesis, which is usually this long piece of writing. My thesis, encompasses the spreadsheet, obviously, with all the information in, and then I have an introduction that explains what it is and how I arrived at it. And to answer the question if it's going to be available any place, I believe that these theses get archived at Signum's library site. So I will be sending it there soon, and then it should be available at least to Signum students and staff.
All right. So open the floor for questions or observations from our audience.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I've never tried this before. Okay. Is there a way to categorize what the situation, what the particular piece of the verse is talking about? Because it seems like, as you mentioned several times, that if they're talking about something else, they're getting different frequencies.
As in subject matter? Is that what you're asking? Yeah.
Like if you're swimming wearing chainmail, you're going to get one set of sets. If you're like feasting in a hall, you're going to get another one, right?
Exactly, and that's kind of the point I'm making too with the dominance of the locatives is in that one passage, is that if you are talking about things that occur in places or about moving from one place to another, that there's going to be a lot more occurrence of locatives than in something where you are, you have someone just giving a speech talking about something philosophical. Yeah, they do kind of get a little philosophical sometimes. So, and that's kind of why I broke it into segments based on the theme or the topical segment of the poem, because you can tell that from the narrative of that passage. As far as your question about whether it could be categorized, it probably could. It could probably mark the database in some way for whether this use is justified by the narrative content of its spot in the poem. I don't know. Does that answer the question really?
Yeah, I think so. I was wondering if there was anything quantitative, but I bet there's not.
And Tim has asked, Sarah, did you notice any inconsistent usages?
Any inconsistencies?
I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Somebody typing or playing with spoons or something. Just remember, you're all unmuted, so.
So.
Anyway, yes. So inconsistencies is what Tim wants to know about.
Okay. Inconsistencies like any can you add anything more to that? Inconsistencies as to what?
And Tim, you can speak if you have a microphone on your computer. So. Oh, okay. Here. Question from someone else, but. Okay, it doesn't sound like or look like Tim is going to respond. So Alexis asked, You mentioned that there may be areas where you can actually see where different writers may have written down sections over time. How did that change your study is the first question, and then does it go between two or more writers is the second question.
Yeah, and the whole concept of authorship in Beowulf has been such a hotly debated topic that I don't think that I've discovered the one key that's going to lay it all to rest or anything like that. It's more just offering another tool for people to use to study those kinds of questions. My own opinion after doing what I've done so far, I mean, this is just my opinion, is that the idea of a really composite authorship, like it was put together by a lot of different people over a long time, is probably not what happened. But there does seem to be some support for a main author or so that used material that was pre-existing in some way and kind of worked it into the poem. And some of the best places to look at that were not included in the selection that I studied. So that's one reason why I'm kind of excited to go on and look at some other places, because the Finnsburg fragment is one place that very, very easily looks like it could have been some kind of story that that was already known, already told, and then you might expect to find some differences if the poet kind of just borrowed that, he incorporated it, smoothed it out a little bit. But yeah, it's as far as authorship, I'm not going to really come out and say that I've discovered anything different or not, because that's asking too much.
All right, and Tim has come back, and remember he asked about the inconsistencies, and he says, for instance, the same preposition but with other cases, or same case with differing prepositions but same meaning.
Okay, yes. It would be very easy with the system that I've set up so far to check which prepositions are used, with individual functions of the dative here. In order to check the preposition usage against different cases, then we'd need to catalog the different cases also, which that could be something that's done at some point. But so far I've been focusing just on the dative case. And prepositions, there is a lot of fluidity to which prepositions get used with which case. I know some grammar and syntax works kind of try to clarify that a certain preposition is used with a certain case, but even they have to talk about exceptions. And it kind of boils down to is there just was a lot of fluidity in language in general, in Old English in particular. It was a very kind of dynamic time period for a language to be, and it was in the process of changing. It was not an entirely analytical language nor entirely synthetic language. It was in the process of going from a very very much case dependent to more of a word order dependent, and you can see that there's both are present in Old English. They have case, which we don't have in our modern language, but they also are quite dependent on word order, more so than you see like in Latin or in some other language that hasn't progressed quite that far. Progressed, some people would say regressed or degressed, but so yeah, inconsistency would probably be more the norm than the exception.
All right, and Tim also asks, why, another example, a possessive dative? Why not use genitive?
Good question. They weren't very common, the possessive datives. They weren't very common among the total number of possessives, and they weren't a very common use of the dative case. And so there may have been certain historical circumstances that governed why those were used. There is a little bit of a logic to it sometimes in context, but not a ton. It's not that I could see.
Yeah, I will say that there are a couple of constructions that are almost always call for a possessive dative, such as the name to me rather than my name, or the name of me, right? That kind of construction, and there are that one, and there's one other typical construction that almost always calls for possessive dative.
And what's likely to happen when you see it in certain constructions like that is there was something historically that just kind of got frozen. We use terms nowadays that it would be strange in our modern grammar. We don't think anything of them because we're used to hearing it. But it's just a kind of a carryover from a previous time when it was more common, or it did actually have a reason.
Okay, and then Tim observes, okay, it's often a matter of convention.
I would say that's a pretty good assessment by this time, by this time period. When you think about convention, you can think about modern English. One of the modern English phrases that the dative case would have evolved into is I'm going to give the book to John. And you see we need a preposition there. We need the preposition to. And we don't say I'm going to give the book John. But we can say I'm going to give John the book without a preposition. Both are perfectly grammatical, both sound just fine, both mean exactly the same thing. But why do we need a preposition with one word order and not the other? It's just the way it is, the way it's become in the language.
Any other questions or observations? Okay. Tim says it's the great green dragon problem. Something like that. Well, let's talk a little bit about your definition of categories and how you came up with those, and where you disagreed with Heller's work, and how you think you've improved on that.
Yeah, well, the categories, interestingly enough, didn't really get set until kind of later in the project. So I knew I wanted categories that were neither too broad nor too narrow, which is probably the point where I most disagreed with other people's, because they either seem to be trying to find some generalities with categories, or to break them down to the smallest possible difference and lump them that way. For example, in Heller's categorization, he would note a difference between a locative use of a physical place or a locative use of a non-physical place, where you might say in my feelings, or in my heart. And that was not going to be terribly useful for this kind of categorization. But I went through the poem, and I identified the uses of the dative first, and then went over those and kind of let them tell me themselves what their categories were. Because when you try to translate it, look at it in context and see what function is this actually fulfilling, and then put a name to it. And as I went on, I saw that some of the names I was putting to it kind of belonged together, and and those got combined into categories. Like like for the locative category, I originally had a difference between a locative where something is in place and something is moving to a place. But eventually I just put them together, because really when you think about it, it's not a significant difference when you're comparing it to a possessive use of the dative. I mean, they're all locatives. They all have to do with place, and they're referring to place. So that's pretty much how I came up with it, was just what am I finding in this selection of the poem? How are these words being used? And then to kind of refine it a little bit so that I was grouping some like things together. And there were some things that are completely standalone, like the dative use with the inflected infinitive is not really like any of the other ones. I think I remember being kind of mad to discover a couple dative of agency in there, because I really felt like I was getting enough categories and didn't want to add something else, but it just didn't. It seemed to be forcing the issue to make it fit into one of the others. So then you give it its own category, and that's pretty much how I went at it.
Okay, and Tim also asked, you may have already mentioned this, I tuned in late, but did you use a particular source for the categories?
I looked at a number of different scholars' works. I had mentioned that I found a master's thesis by Louis G. Heller from Columbia University, where he had gone through and he had categorized and subcategorized and sub-subcategorized. It was this A, B, Roman numeral 1, small Roman numeral, kind of system. So I did look at how he used it. I read a number of grammar works like Bruce Mitchell and like Quirk and Wren, and some other works, and just kind of looked at how they did it, and then applied those to the occurrences in the poem, and to see what would fit, more or less fit with how this particular author was using them. So there were some categories that I didn't need because they never cropped up, or that just seemed to be kind of an attempt to over define what was going on.
All right. Karita asks, are there any bunny trails or lines of questions that you really wanted to go down but needed to set aside to keep your focus clean and concise?
I was so focused that it was kind of hard to even think about anything else. There's the question that tends to keep on derailing you when you're studying something like this in Beowulf is to keep trying to apply it before you're ready. Especially as regards things like date and authorship, because they are such hot topics. And so you're collecting this information, and you do find yourself wanting to just sort of explore if what you have so far fits with anything in particular, but it really is insufficient information to do it with from that perspective. So I would say those were kind of the primary bunny trails, just the basic Beowulf bunny trails that every study of Beowulf seems liable to slide into.
Okay, Tim says inflected languages are children of Cain up from the swamp. All too true, I'm afraid. All right. Well, let me ask then. Were there things? Well, let's go back a little bit. This is, of course, going to be a preliminary question, and one of the things you said in your talk was that doing a project like this and gathering this information could tell us something about date or about authorship. and those kinds of things. So based on what you've done so far, right? So that, of course, this is a preliminary conclusion, but what would you say about the date of Beowulf based on this?
Let's say that we're probably never going to know. Everything that I read on, the question of dating Old English by grammatical means basically said poetry is a whole different field. I mean, they were all based on prose. There was a study on preposition usages by, I think his name was Kurosato, and Ashley Crandall Amos has a work on linguistic means for determining dates in Old English prose, I think is the title. And poetry just winds up being a different baby for several reasons. One is that it tends to be more archaic just in general. The language, we see that ourselves when people write anything. First of all, they are probably writing a more standard or a more formal language than they speak. And then if they go to write poetry, it's different again. And then Old English poetry was also highly formulaic, where there was a lot of rules governing how they could place their phrases and even their words. And so we don't really have the information to judge whether there was a lot of change in that from early Old English to late Old English. And even if we did, do we know, was it stylistic on the part of the author? Was it a conscious choice, or was it actually reflecting changes in the language by that time? So yeah, not going out on any limbs for that one.
All right. And Tim asks, totally off topic, has anyone tried a carbon-14 dating of the manuscript? And I can answer that unless you want to.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'd be glad to.
Nobody has done that. We date the manuscript based on the paleography, the letter shapes, and the script of the manuscript. And so Beowulf is sometime between. We usually give it in terms of 50-year units, and then usually kind of go in the middle of that 50-year unit, unless there's something within the manuscript that can give us a specific date, or at least something narrower. But the Beowulf manuscript, then we say is written between 975 and 1025, so that 50-year period, and so we say usually circa 1000. But that. Go ahead.
The date when the manuscript is written gives you an ending date for when the poem was written, but it doesn't tell you. They could have been copying something or writing something down that had been composed long before as well. So I think they're fairly sure about the date of the manuscript, but it doesn't help much, since there is only one manuscript too. It doesn't help much with dating the poem itself.
Right, and there's been quite a lot of debate as to how much of this is an oral tradition being written down later, or was copied down already, and then the scribes copied it, and how much of it was original composition. So there you have it. At least the short answer.
I lean towards that the scribes were copying something that was written already. I don't think there's sufficient evidence that there's two scribes. I don't think there's sufficient evidence that they were both composing something out of each one's own head. So that does kind of point to copying something that was already written. But as to when it was written, I like earlier dates for things anyway, just because I feel like sometimes people try to date things later out of a feeling that somehow the earlier people were inferior and couldn't have produced something of that magnitude, and that I don't consider that to be a good reason. And even the idea of oral transmission, if you're an oral society, oral transmission is not the kind of the telephone game that we think of it nowadays. I mean, if we try to transmit something orally in our society, it's going to get very garbled. In a society that lived off of this, their standard for repeating things, you know, closer to the same way every time was much higher. Their memories were trained to do this. You know, just because something may have existed orally for a long time doesn't mean that that it was changing every time someone told it either.
Right. And Tim observes, I have the feeling proposing a carbon-14 dating would horrify every manuscript librarian who ever lived. And there's some truth to that. And the Beowulf manuscript in particular has been through 2 fires and some other things that early librarians did to it. So probably taking additional slices out is probably not something they would do unless there was an extreme need. All right, any other questions, observations, debates, problems, celebrations? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending and for the questions that you've asked, and thank you, Sarah. Well done, and we'll talk soon. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Thank you, folks.
All right, thank you.